Welcome, everybody, to the Grueling Truth Sports Network, the NFL show, as always, brought to you by the Replenishing Care and Technologies, rcandt.com. Make sure you check out the PEMF machine or check out the show I just posted on the gruelingtruth.com about the PEMF machine with James Comerford, who is the founder of Replenishing Care and Technologies. I'm your co-host for the NFL show, Mike Goodpaster. Right now, I'd like to welcome in NFL beat writer, Sam Teets. How you doing, Sam?
I'm doing great, Mike. How about you?
All right, and we're going to stay in my wheelhouse, which is the 70s and 80s, when football was football and men were men, and I could say a bunch of other stuff, but I'd probably get in trouble for it. So we're going to look at the top 10 players of the 1980s. We did the 1970s yesterday, Sam. And the 1980s is – the 70s was the start of the explosion. I think the 80s was it was the Mount St. Helens of the 1980s, where the NFL blew up and became, I think, by far the biggest sport in the United States.
Yeah, I was looking through the 80s, and the list of players I was trying to include in the top 10. I mean, it's so much deeper than even the 70s was. So I think this is when football cemented itself as America's sport and as the best sport in this country.
All right, so the 1980s. Player number 10. I'm going to start it out today. We let you start it yesterday. I'm going to go number 10, Walter Payton. And I think even though he was probably maybe the NFL's premier all-around football player, a lot of people are going to say at number 10. Here's my deal on that. Much of Payton's best work came in the mid to late 70s, including 1,852 yards, 16 touchdowns in 1977. And Sam, how many games did they play then?
Was it 14 by any chance?
Yes, it was. Now, he continued to be the Bears' workhorse through 1986, but I think the players ranked higher on this list enjoyed more of their prime during the 80s. And Walter Payton, the thing that sticks out to me is Super Bowl 20, where they give the ball to the fridge instead of Walter Payton. Payton gets upset about that. I know Mike Ditka's cut a lot of crap over the years about it, but I got Walter Payton at number 10.
Yeah, I think that's justifiable because he was such a good player. I do think arguably his best 4 seasons came in the 70s, but he did have a couple all-pro years in the 80s, and he was very consistent back. Like, even 10 years into his career, he was still being productive, still a 1,000-yard rusher easily.
All right, who do you got at number 10?
I personally went a little bit of a different direction in my list. I'm trying to make it a little different from yours. I think I got some good arguments, too. I've got Dwight Steffensen at number 10. And this is a guy people
wait a second. You did not have a good argument when you called Dwight Stevenson Dwight Steffensen.
You know what? You know what? I actually thought about that before this show. I actually took the time to figure that out because I keep thinking about Steph Curry and how the name's pronounced differently. And then I came out here and I messed it up anyways. But I had Dwight Stevenson at number 10. And I think he's vastly overlooked when we talk about some of the best offensive linemen of all time. He was a member of the Miami Dolphins from 1980 through 1987. He's gone now as one of the greatest centers in history. 5 Pro Bowls, 4-time first-team All-Pro. Unfortunately, his career ended a little bit early. I would like to see what would have happened if he'd stayed and played longer. And he ended up making, I think, two Super Bowls with that Miami Dolphins team. I would have loved to see him play longer, but he had a very high peak.
Yeah, I think there's a case to be made that Dwight Stevenson was the best center in NFL history. I think he's definitely top 3 or 4. Absolutely great player. I did not have him on my list because I think when we look at the list comparing the 80s to the 70s, I think the 80s list is even stronger than the 70s.
No, I agree. I think the 80s list is much deeper. I was going through it, and the 70s process, it was actually pretty easy for me. It didn't take me that long to put together a list for the 1970s. But there were legitimately about 15 to 20 candidates who really could have earned spots on this one.
Yeah, and I tried to go a little different. I went number 9, Howie Long. And Howie Long, I think, is one of those players who his prime fell squarely in the decade of the 80s. And I think from 1983 to 85, there was no better defensive lineman in the league, period. And this is an era that included Randy White, Reggie White, Richard Dent, Fred Dean, Joe Klecko, Mark Gastineau. That's saying a lot. And Long was the principal defensive force on the 1983 Raiders, who demolished the Redskins' record-breaking offense in Super Bowl 38. So I've got Howie Long at number 9.
Yeah, I don't have Howie Long on my list, actually. I did consider him, but he was not in my top 10. I just do want to point out one thing. Greg Gerke's listening again today. He says, great pick, Sam, on my last selection, so I'm happy. I like Greg too, Mike. We all like Greg, I think, on this show.
Well, I sent Greg a message and asked him to try to give you some confidence.
Oh, okay.
Now, Schmeck, whatever this is, says that Walter Payton deserves better than number 10. I think when you look at this, I don't see Walter Payton above number 9 just because of the fact the bulk of his great years were 1977 to probably about 1981, 82. After that, I mean, he was still a really good running back. But, and here you go. I'll give it to you right now. Greg said, great pick, Sam. But
yeah,
really,
on that.
If you put it like this, if you went top 10 players from 1975 to 1985, Walter Payton would be my number 1 guy.
Yeah, absolutely. He'd definitely be up there for that. But like you said, it's hard when a player's career is split between 2 decades. It's very hard to include them on a list like this.
All right, who do you got at number 9, Sam?
Well, going off what I just said, I kind of broke my own rule. I actually have John Hanna at number 9. I didn't include him on yesterday's list, and I kind of felt bad about it because he's possibly, I think, in my opinion, at least the best guard in NFL history. And he did have some very good years in the 70s, but he did have 4 first-team All-Pro seasons in the 80s. And, of course, they made it to the Super Bowl one year, got destroyed by the Bears. So I think that he deserves a spot in the top 10.
Yeah, I believe he does too. I didn't have him on there, but I knew from hearing yesterday's show you would have him there. So I let Howie Long come on just for that reason. Who do you got at number 8, Sam?
And number 8, and this is a player I debated about having on just because he didn't win a Super Bowl, but he is Dan Marino. And like I said, I'm a little conflicted about this because I believe winning Super Bowls is a huge testament to quarterbacks. Another quarterback who I didn't include on the list was John Elway, but he didn't win a Super Bowl during the 80s either. So
did you say you included Elway or didn't include Elway?
I did not include Elway.
Hmm.
I'm probably going to get some slack for that. But I think Marino dominated from 84 to about 87, or even from 84 to 87. He was probably the most statistically dominant quarterback in the NFL at that point. He won an MVP and Offensive Player of the Year during the 80s. He was a 3-time first-team All-Pro. Of course, the big issue with Dan Marino always is he didn't win a Super Bowl. Neither did Elway during that decade, but Elway got much closer than Marino did.
Well, how about this? My number 8 is John Elway. And I think determining Elway's place on this list is tricky because the 90s were probably his better decade because people forget Elway did struggle often in his first 3 NFL seasons. He threw 52 interceptions, only 47 touchdown passes the first 3 years. Elway did win an NFL MVP in 1987. And my difference between Elway and Marino, I actually have Marino higher on the list as a greater player, but I will give Elway this. He went to the Super Bowl in 86, 87, and 89 with Broncos teams that I think a lot of quarterbacks couldn't have got to the Super Bowl with. I think he was the greatest comeback artist in NFL history. I mean, if he's not, he's right there with Roger Staubach. And you look, I mean, there's probably 5 or 6 iconic playoff comebacks he's made. And if you look at the 86 AFC Championship game, the 92 or 98-yard drive against Cleveland in the last 4 minutes of the game in Cleveland, in the dog pound with all those inbred Cleveland Browns fans throwing milk bones at him, that was as great a drive as you'll ever see. So I've got Elway at number 8. I've got Marino at number 7. The reason is this. You know, he played 7 seasons in the 80s, and in 3 of them, he was named first-team All-Pro. That's impressive. But 1984 may still be the most impressive offensive season in NFL history. 5,084 yards, 48 touchdowns in an era when defensive backs were allowed to play a lot more aggressively than they are now. You look at 1985, I think the Bears were, 11-0 or 12-0 going to Miami. Marino puts 38 points on that great Bears defense. So I think when you're just talking about playing-wise, I think that the fact that I got Marino number 7 tells you how great the players are that are going to be in front of him. But Dan Marino is a pure passer for that 7 years in the 1980s was as good as anybody. My one concern, if I rate Marino and Elway all time, Elway's in front of him, not just because of the Super Bowls, but also the fact that Marino, people forget this. In 1985, I think they'd beaten the Patriots twice, and the Patriots go into Miami for the championship game. And I don't think New England had won in Miami since like 1969 or 1970. And Marino played horrible. They get beat like 35-14. And then in 1992, they're the number 1 seed over the Buffalo Bills. Marino plays terrible again, and they lose the game 29-10. So to me, there's two cases where Marino had a team that he probably should have gotten to the Super Bowl and he came up short. Same thing being said, he doesn't win either one of those Super Bowls probably if he gets in them. But my number 7 is Dan Marino. Who do you have?
Yeah, my number 7 is going a little bit entirely different route off the quarterbacks. I've got Mike Singletary at my number 7. He's a Super Bowl champion, 1985 and 1988 Defensive Player of the Year, and he's a 5-time, actually a 6-time first-team All-Pro selection in that decade. So when we're talking about dominance at a position, I mean, Dan Marino was very dominant statistically at his own position, but Mike Singletary was probably the best linebacker from this decade in terms of the complete resume put together. He was still a good player at the very beginning of the 1990s.
You mean the back middle linebacker, right?
Yeah. Not I know who you're referring to. Not better than that guy, but Mike Singletary was definitely the best middle linebacker from this decade in terms of just what he accomplished in the 80s.
All right, where are we at? Number 6?
Yep.
All right, go ahead. Who you got at number 6?
Number 6, I have Ronnie Lott. And Lott was a little bit difficult to place on this list because I knew I wanted to have him fairly high up. I didn't want to have him at like 10 or 9 or 8. But at the same point, there's trying between him and Mike Singletary kept flopping back and forth. But Lott was a player who came in to the league as a cornerback, was an All-Pro as a corner, and then switched to safety when he was not having as much success as he had at the very beginning of his career. And he becomes an All-Pro safety and one of the greatest safeties of all time.
All right, I actually got Ronnie Lott a little bit higher, I believe. My number 6 is Eric Dickerson. I would like to put him higher, but, you know, his first 2 years in the NFL represent the top 2-season debut of any player in league history, irrespective of position. In 1983, 1,808 yards. And, you know, then he breaks the single-season rushing mark with 2,105 in 1984, a record that still stands to this day. And he was an unstoppable force. The sole issue with him, you know, he had contractual issues, and he ended up being a distraction kind of for the Rams and the Colts. I think that hurts him on the list. But the one thing you do got to remember is the Colts made the playoffs in 1987 once they got Eric Dickerson. And when you look at the Rams, he wasn't always playing with the greatest of quarterbacks, and he was a big-time player in the playoffs at a lot of occasions. And I did have the wild card game in 86 against the Redskins in RFK, a game that they could have won where he fumbled a few times, and fumbling was a little bit of an issue with him. But the game that stands out to me for him as his greatest was 1985 when he ran for 248 yards when they shut out the Dallas Cowboys 28-0 the week before going to Chicago and losing. I think Eric Dickerson, maybe the greatest pure runner I've ever seen. I've got him at number 6, Sam.
I've actually got Eric Dickerson a little bit higher on my list, but I totally agree with you with everything you said. He would definitely have to be in the top 10. I think he's one of the players you just can't debate. He has to be a top 10, if not top 5 guy on almost every list.
All right, who you got?
Yeah, so my number 5 is Jerry Rice, and this is a player who kind of split the decade, who really came in around the middle of the 80s, and he didn't have that like the same burst Eric Dickerson had right out of the gate. He was not a phenomenal player as a rookie, but he closed out the decade with 4 consecutive first-team All-Pro selections. He led the league in receiving yards twice in those final 4 years. He led the league in receiving touchdowns 3 times in those years. So I think based on what he became at beginning in his second season, Jerry Rice is a top 10 player for this decade. I might have him a little bit too high just because I'm remembering who he is exactly for the rest of his career. The 90s was when he really dominated, but I think even in the early 80s or mid-80s, he was a dominant player.
I've got him listed the same spot you do at number 5. I think people forget his rookie season, he had a lot of trouble dropping passes. But once you get to the end of 85, he was starting to carve teams up. Then in 1986, he posted 1,570 receiving yards. In 1987, he caught an insane 22 touchdown passes in 12 games. And the following season ended with him being the Super Bowl MVP in Super Bowl 23 against the Bengals. And then he closed out the decade with 1,483 yards and 17 touchdowns in 89. Now, I know he wasn't in the league for the first half of the decade, but Rice was the best player in the game by the time you get to 1990.
Yeah, I think when we talk about it, like the receiving touchdown totals really sets him apart. He was scoring left and right. He was also an offensive player of the year in there. I think it was 1987. So he has the accolades to be a top 5 player on this list, despite missing half a decade.
All right, we'll go ahead to my number 4 because it's somebody you've already mentioned, and that was Ronnie Lott. And I think a lot of people forget that his rookie season, 1981, when he goes to the Niners had that great draft. Carlton Williamson, they picked up like their entire defensive backfield in the first 2 rounds. He made the Pro Bowl 4 times as a cornerback, then 4 times more as a safety by 1990. The one year he missed out on the postseason was 1985. He played both positions in 85, which is why he didn't make it on either one. San Francisco won 4 Super Bowls in the 1980s, with Lott taking part in each triumph. And, I mean, this is a guy that we see a lot of guys that will play quarterback up until like 32, 33, 34 years old, and they transition to safety like Rod Woodson did. Ronnie Lott's one of the few guys where you see he enters the league in 1981 as a cornerback. By 1986, he's a Pro Bowl safety also.
Yeah, there are very few guys who make that switch and make it early in their careers and make it very successful. There are some guys who we've seen transition, some like a Charles Woodson who had success at corner and then moved to safety, but he had to because of age. Ronnie Lott didn't necessarily have to move, but he did. And he became one of the greatest safeties of all time. He proved he's probably one of the most versatile defensive backs we've ever seen.
All right. Who you got at number 4?
My number 4 is Eric Dickerson. And the stat that stands out to me is during those 7 seasons he played during the 1980s, he recorded over 11,000 rushing yards. So doing that in 7 seasons, that's got to be one of the fastest and best starts by a running back in NFL history. He had 4 years where he led the league in rushing yards. He led the league in rushing touchdowns in 1984. And he was, during those 7 years, a 5-time first-team All-Pro. And in 1986, he was an Offensive Player of the Year. So he basically did everything you could ask a running back to do in terms of being a one-man wrecking crew and a one-man offense. I think if he had been on a better team, a more complete team, we could have seen a lot more postseason success from Eric Dickerson.
All right, number 3, Sam.
So this is where we get into, I think, the all-time greatest guys we talk about who are maybe in the top 20 players of all time. I got Anthony Munoz at number 3. And it's pretty plain and simple for me. He's the best offensive lineman and the best tackle of all time. There's no debate about it.
Was that all you got, Sam?
All right, do you want me to talk about his 8 first-team All-Pro selections in the decade, his 9 Pro Bowls, his dominance throughout the entire decade and even into the early 90s? You want me to mention that part?
Well, see, my thing is this. These top 3, I think 2 of them are the greatest to ever played a position. The other one has a claim. My number 3 is going to be Joe Montana. Now, the reason I go number 3 is because I believe my number 1 and 2 are the 2 best players by far to ever play their position. But I really feel stupid putting Joe Montana number 3 in the 80s. I mean, because when you look at him, he played 4 Super Bowls, 11 touchdowns, 0 interceptions. That's, of course, because Lewis Billups choked away Super Bowl 23 when it hit him in the chest. He was the MVP 3 times. The thing that people forget is you always hear people talk about, well, yeah, he had Rice, and he had Taylor, and he had all these guys. Super Bowl 16 in 1981, there was no Jerry Rice or John Taylor or Roger Craig. It was Earl Cooper, Mike Wilson, Dwight Clark, still good players, but that 49ers team, it wasn't like Montana was throwing for 400 yards a game. I mean, he was a guy where the defense was really good in 1981. He didn't turn the ball over. You had the great comeback against the Dallas Cowboys. They win the Super Bowl against the Bengals. He completely outplays Dan Marino. Maybe not Marino's fault. Maybe it's just because the Niners in 1984 had one of the greatest defenses of all time. But the 11 touchdowns and 0 interceptions to me is pretty damn good. And like I said, the only reason he's at number 3 is because I think the other 2 guys are the best to ever play their position.
Yeah, no, I understand that because I know who your top 2 are. I can totally guess them. So I agree. I can understand. And not putting Joe Montana at number 1 is understandable because I don't have him at number 1 either. I have him at number 2 for all the reasons you just listed. And like I said, 4 Super Bowls, 3 Super Bowl MVPs, 1989 League MVP, and Offensive Player of the Year. He went on to have some success early 90s as well, especially 1990. But to me, if you would ask me in 2010, who was the best quarterback of all time, it would easily have been Joe Montana. I think the answer has changed since then. But at the time, a decade ago, it was Joe Montana.
Yeah, and still, it's hard to pick between Brady and Montana for me.
Yeah, I think you can go back and forth easily. I've seen people still put Joe Montana at number 1, and it's totally understandable.
All right, so I got to pick between my top two, which we all know is Anthony Munoz and Lawrence Taylor. The thing about both of these guys is the Giants and Bengals, when they arrived, were not very good teams. But as soon as they arrived, both teams became good teams. And I'm going to go number 2 is Anthony Munoz. He's an 8-time first-team All-Pro, as you said. The only 2 times he didn't make it was in 1980 when he was a rookie and 1984 when he was second team. He was considered the third best offensive lineman. Now, Munoz was a frontline starter on 2 Bengals Super Bowl teams, Super Bowl 16, Super Bowl 23. The amazing thing about Munoz that I think people forget is he played baseball for Ron Dado at USC, which is considered back in the 80s, 70s, the best baseball program in college baseball, basically. And Anthony Munoz played shortstop and third base and pitched. I mean, the dude was an unbelievable athlete. He was the NFL Man of the Year once in the late 80s. And he was a guy that you will never hear anybody say they don't like if they've met him. I have had the chance to meet him a couple times, and he's as great a man as he is a player, which is why I hate to put him at number 2 and a cokehead at number 1. There, I said it. But I just think that when you get to number 1, we're both picking Lawrence Taylor, correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
And to me, I mean, he's one of 2 defensive players in league history to be the NFL MVP. In 1986, I mean, he lifted his game to another level. He had 20 and a half sacks as the best player on the Super Bowl champion Giants. And, I mean, the thing about Taylor is Bill Parcells and Bill Belichick basically designed the defense for him when he got there. And in 1981, you know, it wasn't Phil Simms as a Pro Bowl quarterback winning them games. It was Scott Bruner through a lot of that season. And they actually gave the 49ers all they could handle the first 3 quarters in the divisional playoffs. You get to 82, they kind of fell apart. 83, they fell apart. Parcells is about to get canned, basically. How does that change NFL history if Parcells gets fired there? And then 1984, they make the playoffs. They beat the Rams in L.A., and then they go on the road and they lose to the 49ers again. And that was a great Niners team. It was only 21-10. 85, they get shut out 21-0 by the Bears. And then you get to 1986. But the thing about Lawrence Taylor, Robert Brazile, we've had on the show years ago, and Lawrence Taylor completely redefined the outside linebacker position. Brazile first at 75-76 when he goes to the Oilers, and he's got Bum Phillips, who basically designs a defense around Robert Brazile. The New York Giants do it in 1981. And, I mean, after that, this is a dude that, I mean, how many guys could play successfully on cocaine, much less be the best player at their position?
Yeah, he had those off-the-field issues, but I think I put O.J. Simpson in like my top 3 from the 1970s, so I can't really fault Lawrence Taylor in this situation. I have him at number 1 just because.
Wait a second, though. What did O.J. Simpson do in the 1970s that we know of?
I don't know about during the 1970s, but after his playing time.
Well, that was like 20 years after he killed a lady. It happens.
Significantly worse than what Lawrence Taylor did, but
that's nothing to joke about. I apologize to the politically incorrect police. But, I mean, when you look at it, I mean, Lawrence Taylor was the best that ever played a game. And I think if you're listening to greatest football players of all time, a lot of people are going to have him number 1.
He's top 5 easily. Like that's the lowest I would go with Lawrence Taylor. We're talking all time. He would be top 5 without a doubt.
See, to me, Munoz and Taylor are the same. I mean, they're guys that have to be top 5 because they're the guys at their position. There's been really good offensive tackles, Larry Allen's, guys like that. Nobody like Munoz. And the rules were different. It was tougher to play back then. And with Lawrence Taylor, the only outside linebacker I've seen comparable was Jack Ham.
Yeah, I don't think it's close for Lawrence Taylor. I mean, I know Jack, like, I'm a Steelers fan. I respect Jack Ham to the utmost, and I think he is highly underrated.
You know, so would you rather have Jack Ham drop it into coverage to cover a running back or Lawrence Taylor? I'd rather have Jack Ham.
Yeah, Jack Ham in that regard. In that regard, I would have Jack Ham.
Yeah, so, I mean, there is something Jack Ham can do better than Lawrence Taylor. But Lawrence Taylor wasn't bad in coverage either. It was just the defense was drawn up for him to be that way. maybe if he goes to Pittsburgh in 1975 and they draw the defense up for him to be Jack Ham, he's a better version of Jack Ham than Jack Ham is. We'll never know. But to me, Lawrence Taylor, hands down, Anthony Munoz, hands down, the best to ever play their positions.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there's no debating Lawrence Taylor at the number one spot on this list. I've thought about it with Joe Montana. I thought about it with Anthony Munoz. But it's just a 3-time Defensive Player of the Year and League MVP. I can't overlook Lawrence Taylor.
All right, so we doing the 1990s tomorrow?
Yeah, let's go for it.
I don't really care about anything that's happened this century, so we'll wrap up the series with the 1990s tomorrow. You want to tell everybody where they can find you?
Yeah, you can find me here on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook at Sam_Teets33. Constantly posting new articles and stuff there every day, so feel free to go check that out.
All right, you can follow me at Grueling Truth. Make sure you go like our Facebook group page, The Grueling Truth, of course. Read all of our articles. Check out all of our podcasts on thegruelingtruth.com. Me and Sam will be back at 1 tomorrow to count down the top 10 players of the 1990s. And once again, I'm going to bring this up again. Greg Gorecki said, great pick, Sam. All right.
We appreciate Greg on the show.
Yeah, we want to thank everybody that listened to the show today. And we will be back tomorrow. Make sure you check out Replenishing Care and Technologies, RCANDT.com. And Greg had another comment, and we want to thank Greg for that. Greg, you're invited to come on the show whenever you want. See if he answers. I think he just doesn't want to talk with Sam because Sam's young.
Okay, Mike.
All right, guys, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. Remember, you can check the podcast version of this out on every place that shows power has podcasts, including iHeartRadio, iTunes, TuneIn, Spreaker, Stitcher, Spotify. So wherever you find podcast or video cast, is that what they call it, Sam? You're younger than me.
I have no idea. I got told this is a vodcast or something like that. I just call it a podcast for the longest time. Yeah.
Well, vodcast sounds stupid. So wherever you find vodcast, you'll find The Grueling Truth. So for now, for Sam Teets, I'm Mike Goodpaster. You've been listening to The Grueling Truth, where the legends speak.